I have attempted many names for this. The panorama, obviously, to go with the zoom lens, the accelerated narrative. I think what I have landed on, and there's a reason why we're going to call it this, is the bedtime story or the campfire story, bedtime campfire story. And the reason for that is because when we sit down to tell or hear a bedtime story or a campfire story, there's this expectation that we're going to get to the end, right? When we begin the story, we know we're going to get to the end in one sitting. There's not this idea that this is going to take more than one sitting. And so there's a real emphasis on plot, like what comes next, what do we need to know to get to the end, right? A really, really good example of this are fairy tales. So when we sit down to hear a fairy tale, Little Red Riding Hood took her basket and went into the woods and then met the wolf and then went to grandma's house and blah, 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 right? We know that it's all going to resolve for us by the time we get the end. And so in order to tell a story with what I call an accelerated narrative, and I used to call this the accelerated narrative, but I think this is easier to picture, this bedtime story or this campfire story. So in order to tell a story that has an accelerated narrative, we're really trying to get from, here to here. Maybe we're telling this entire year in the story, right? Or the whole 3 days, right? So in order to get from point A to point B within the reasonable time frame of a flash fiction narrative, we have to go fast, right? We have to go fast. So we're not going to linger on any details. We're not going to linger particularly on backstory, exposition. We're not going to get deeply into what a character looks like or what the smell of things are, unless it's really pertinent to the plot, right? So when we're telling the plot of a story, we have to ask ourselves, what's going to get us to the end quicker? So you don't have to write fairy tales to write an accelerated narrative, but I think it's a great example of the expectation that we're going to sit down, we're going to tell the story from beginning to end. We're going to leave out anything extraneous. And there's this push, right? There's this urgency. And so when we're telling a story that quickly, when we're trying to get to the end that quickly, there's a natural tension that will start to happen. In contrast, when you were telling the zoom lens story, most likely your story focused on a moment of high tension or maybe a moment directly adjacent to a moment of high tension or high energy, right? With the accelerated narrative, with the bedtime story, we don't necessarily give any piece of high tension a whole lot more emphasis than any other. We're really kind of getting from beginning to end. And I've heard writers tell me that sometimes when they're writing an accelerated narrative, before they get comfortable with the form, that they feel a little bit like they're just telling us what happened, right? And there is a little bit of that. There is a little bit of this idea that we're not languishing in our description and in our beautiful vocabulary and all of this. There can be that feeling. And yet, when it's done well, and it's done well a lot, you will find that the tone comes through in the plot choices that you make, in the kind of almost straight-faced way that you'll tell the story. There's not a whole lot of time to languish in these details, right? So another way of looking at it is think about yourself as a tour guide of the story. So if the story is taking place over a year, you're the tour guide who's filling up the train full of passengers, and you are going to take us on the highlights, right? Highlights of the story. Things you need to know. They met, they moved, they had a baby, they whatever it may be, right? And as a tour guide, again, there's this expectation that you're going to get us to the end by the time the sitting is done, by the time the frame is over, by the time the story completes. So this kind of narrative, until you get your footing in it, can be a little bit intimidating or tricky. So what I would say is go back to your list. Again, this is why you have a list. I hope you've added to it. go back to your list, pick another story, and I might not choose a story that takes place over a decade. I might choose a story that takes place over a couple of months, maybe 6 months or less would be a good target to start with. Pick one of these stories and then just almost factually start telling the story as if there are a group of people sitting around the campfire and you are going to entertain them for the next 5 minutes, right? So rather than focusing on the most important 5 minutes in the story, imagine instead that you only have 5 minutes to tell the story. So it's kind of the opposite, right? So try that. I've got some examples, and I think once you get into the hang of it, you're going to know what I'm talking about. But give it a shot.